Okay, so you're probably here because you saw those headlines about the USPS and suspending package deliveries from China. And maybe you're waiting on a package yourself, or you've got a business that relies on getting stuff shipped from over there. Either way, we're going to break it all down for you today and really dive deep into what's going on with all of this. We've got some great sources lined up. So let's forget all that clickbaity stuff. Let's really get into the why of all this.
Well, it's interesting how many people think that the USPS just has its own cargo planes and they're just zipping back and forth between, here and China. But it's the reality is way more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's not just, one postal service plane taking off. It's this whole global network. We're talking commercial airlines, cargo ships, all these things that go into moving these packages around. So when the USPS says we're suspending service, it's not really like flipping a switch. It's really a symptom of some much bigger issues going on.
Yeah, and we're really seeing kind of the domino effect of a bunch of global disruptions. Going back to the pandemic, you've got the spiking fuel costs, trade restrictions all over the place. All of those have really led to airlines cutting back on how much cargo they can carry. Fewer planes, less space, and that really squeezes the USPS.
Yeah, one of the sources we were looking at actually had this map, and it had this big X over these major trade routes. It was like a visual representation of how things are getting bottlenecked.
Exactly. When you have limited capacity like that, the USPS, they have to prioritize what they can actually handle. And unfortunately, it looks like shipments from China are at the bottom of that list right now.
Yeah, and it's not just planes in space, though. There's this whole other layer to it, and that's customs regulations.
Right.
And how those are really impacting how goods are flowing.
Yeah, the U.S. has been tightening up these regulations specifically for stuff coming from China. And it's all tied to concerns about counterfeit products, making sure things meet safety standards and even worries about, national security.
So just imagine you're excited for that online purchase. You're waiting for it to show up. And then it gets stuck in customs because they think it might be fake. I mean, how frustrating would that be?
Ugh, I know.
And the sources were pointing out that this isn't even a one-time thing. The USPS has temporarily suspended services from other countries in the past for pretty much the same reasons.
It's definitely a pattern. A few years back, there was that whole issue with mention a past headline from the source. I mean, that really threw a wrench into the whole system. And it feels like we're kind of seeing a repeat of that now.
Okay, so we've got these logistical bottlenecks, we've got stricter regulations, but there's this other thing kind of looming in the background, isn't there? I mean, all this tension between the U.S. and China everyone keeps talking about.
Yeah, you can't ignore the politics of it all. There's been this trade war brewing for years now, and it's definitely having an impact.
And the USPS being a government service, well, they can get caught in the middle of all of that. Mention a specific example of a tariff or tech ban from the source, for example. That shows how these political moves can have a direct impact on something as simple as getting a package delivered.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. And what we really need to do now is shift our focus to you, the listener. Because this isn't just about headlines, this is having a real impact on people's lives.
Yeah, this is hitting home for a lot of folks. I mean, small business owners are feeling it especially hard. Every delay means they're losing money. And in some cases, they're even losing their customers' trust.
And for regular consumers, you're talking longer shipping times, surprise costs maybe, even the risk of orders getting canceled altogether. And think about all the people who rely on platforms like AliExpress or Temu to get affordable stuff. This is creating a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and one of the sources we read actually had this story about a small business owner who was practically in tears because their entire inventory was stuck. Their whole business was on hold because of all this disruption.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the logistics and regulations of it all. But at the end of the day, there are real people whose livelihoods are being affected by this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, but what can we actually do about it? We can't just sit here and complain. I mean, are there any options, strategies to deal with all this?
Yeah, let's get practical here. So first off, are there any alternatives to using the USPS if you need to get stuff from China?
Definitely. You've got those private carriers like DHL, FedEx, UPS. They're often still up and running even when the USPS suspends service.
But those probably come with a higher price tag, right?
Yeah, there's a trade-off there for sure. Speed and reliability versus cost. But if you absolutely need something quickly, it might be worth looking into.
Okay, what about those local warehouses I keep hearing about? Do those help with this whole China shipping mess?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of Chinese sellers are using fulfillment centers here in the US now, or they're working with those third-party logistics companies. So when you're shopping online, look for that ships from US label. That means you're basically sidestepping that whole international shipping nightmare.
So I can avoid those delays and headaches by just buying something that's already here in the US.
Exactly. And this is super useful on sites like Amazon or eBay. You can usually filter your search results to prioritize those domestically shipped items.
Okay, so we've got some options for consumers. But what about businesses that really rely on those Chinese suppliers? What are their alternatives?
Well, this might be a wake-up call for some businesses to really look at diversifying their supply chains. Maybe it's time to start thinking about manufacturing in Mexico, Vietnam, or even bringing some of that production back to the US.
I mean, that's a pretty big move for a business, though.
Ah,
Are there any, smaller steps they can take in the meantime?
for sure. Start by taking a close look at your current suppliers. Can you renegotiate some of those contracts? Maybe explore getting volume discounts or look at different payment terms to help with cash flow.
So it's more about making those existing relationships work better rather than making huge changes right away.
Right. And don't forget, there are resources out there to help. Industry associations, trade groups, even government agencies. They can offer support and guidance to help businesses navigate all of this.
So it's all about tapping into that network and learning from others who've been through it before.
Exactly. Even taking small steps can lead to big changes down the line.
Okay, so we've covered some solutions for both businesses and consumers. But is there anything else people can do to just stay ahead of this whole situation?
Well, staying informed is key. Keep an eye on those USPS service alerts, track your packages closely, and don't hesitate to reach out to customer service if anything seems off.
So basically, just be proactive and stay on top of things.
Exactly. And remember, this situation is constantly changing, so being flexible and able to adapt quickly is really important.
Now, amidst all this chaos, I'm wondering if there could be a silver lining to this whole USPS suspension. Could this disruption actually lead to some positive changes down the line?
That's an interesting thought. I mean, maybe this is forcing businesses and consumers to think outside the box, explore new avenues and ultimately find more sustainable solutions.
Like we talked about, businesses looking for alternative suppliers. Maybe this is the push they need to revive domestic manufacturing or take a more balanced approach to global sourcing.
It's a chance to really reevaluate those long, intricate supply chains that are so vulnerable to disruption. Maybe we'll see more regional production hubs popping up, reducing reliance on a single country and strengthening those supply chains.
So less dependence on China and a more resilient system overall.
Exactly. And for consumers, maybe this is a wake-up call to be more conscious about their consumption habits. Do we really need everything shipped from across the globe? Can we support local businesses more? Can we prioritize quality over quantity?
So maybe this disruption will spark a bigger conversation about responsible consumption, ethical sourcing, and the true cost of those cheap goods we've all become so used to.
It's definitely a possibility. Sometimes you need a shake-up to really reevaluate your priorities.
Well said. It's a classic case of every cloud has a silver lining. This USPS situation is causing a lot of headaches right now, but maybe it could actually be the catalyst for some positive change in the long run.
I think I agree. It's an opportunity to adapt, innovate, and build a more resilient and sustainable future.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners are probably wondering about the future. When will the USPS resume shipping from China? What's the long-term impact of all this? Any insights you can share?
I wish I had a crystal ball. Predicting the future is always tricky. But based on what we know so far, I think it's reasonable to expect that the USPS will eventually resume shipping from China. The demand is just too high for this to be a permanent thing.
But the big question is when, right?
Exactly. And that depends on a whole bunch of factors. Many of them are outside the USPS's control. We need to see progress on those global logistics challenges, maybe some easing of trade tensions, and potentially even some changes to those customs regulations.
So it's a really complex web of politics, economics, and logistics.
It really is. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces need to fall into place before things can go back to normal.
That's a good way to put it. So we can't really pinpoint a date, but we can at least understand the factors that'll influence that timeline.
Exactly. And in the meantime, the key is to stay informed. Explore those alternatives we talked about, and be prepared for more bumps along the way. This is just a reminder that the global landscape is constantly changing, and we need to be ready to adapt.
Well said. So let's dig a bit deeper into those solutions we touched on earlier. What can businesses and consumers actually do to navigate this environment?
Yeah, let's empower our listeners with some actionable strategies.
So let's start with businesses. One of the biggest concerns I keep hearing is finding those reliable suppliers. We talked about exploring manufacturing in other countries, but are there any other options?
Well, one strategy that's gaining traction is nearshoring, basically bringing production closer to home. For U.S. businesses, that might mean partnering with suppliers in Canada or Mexico, or even bringing some operations back to the U.S.
Yeah, that makes sense. Shorter supply chains means faster delivery, lower transportation costs, and less exposure to those global risks.
Exactly. And beyond just diversifying geographically, businesses should also look at diversifying their supplier base. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Having multiple options gives you a cushion if disruptions happen.
Yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
Precisely. Spreading the risk makes your business much more resilient.
I know a lot of our listeners are small business owners, and I can imagine this all sounds a bit overwhelming, like I don't have the resources to revamp my entire supply chain. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Not everyone can make those massive changes overnight, but even small steps can make a big difference.
Okay, give us some examples.
Well, start by analyzing your existing supplier relationships. Are there any opportunities to renegotiate those contracts? Maybe explore volume discounts or look at alternative payment terms? Those can really help improve your cash flow.
So it's more about optimizing what you already have instead of starting from scratch?
Right, and don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are industry associations, trade groups, and even government agencies out there that are dedicated to helping small businesses through these kinds of challenges.
So it's all about tapping into that network and seeking guidance from those who have experience in these situations.
Exactly. Even small steps can have a big impact over time. Don't underestimate the power of incremental progress.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about consumers. What can individuals do to navigate this whole USPS situation and make sure their packages actually arrive safely and on time?
Well, the first thing is knowledge is power. Stay up to date on those USPS service alerts. Track your packages diligently. And don't hesitate to contact customer service if you have any questions or concerns.
So be proactive and stay informed.
Exactly. And as we mentioned earlier, consider those alternative shipping methods if getting your package quickly is a top priority. Those private carriers like DHL, FedEx, and UPS are often still operating even when the USPS suspends services.
True, but those usually come with a higher price tag.
That's true. It's all about finding that balance between cost and convenience, but sometimes that extra cost is worth the peace of mind.
Absolutely. Another tip for consumers would be to be mindful of where you're shopping online. Like we said earlier, look for items that are being shipped from warehouses here in the US. That way you can avoid those international shipping delays altogether.
And if you're ordering from marketplaces like AliExpress, Temu, or Shein, just be prepared for potential delays and factor that into your expectations.
Yeah, patience is definitely a virtue in this situation.
It really is. And remember, communication is key. If you're unsure about shipping times or have any concerns, just reach out to the seller and ask.
Yeah, that open communication can prevent a lot of misunderstandings and frustration down the line.
Absolutely. And finally, I just encourage consumers to think about the bigger picture when making purchasing decisions.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this whole USPS suspension really highlights how interconnected the global economy is. Our choices as consumers have ripple effects that go way beyond our individual transactions.
So we should be more conscious about where our products are coming from, how they're made, and the overall impact our purchases have on the world.
Exactly. It's about making informed choices that align with our values. Whether that's supporting local businesses, buying sustainable products, or just reducing our overall consumption,
Yeah.
every decision matters.
That's a really powerful point.
Mhm.
We have more power than we realize to shape the world through our everyday choices.
We do. And who knows, maybe this disruption will inspire us all to become more thoughtful and intentional consumers.
Okay, so before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to circle back to something we kind of touched on earlier. Could this whole USPS suspension thing actually be like a catalyst for a bigger shift in global manufacturing? It's a tough question, but what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, it's definitely possible. We've already been seeing companies kind of moving production away from China over the past few years, rising labor costs, trade tensions, all that stuff, concerns about intellectual property.
Right, and this whole USPS thing could just add fuel to that fire.
Yeah, exactly. All those disruptions and the uncertainty with international shipping, well, it could make businesses think twice about relying so heavily on Chinese suppliers.
So we might start seeing a trend towards like more regional manufacturing, companies setting up shop closer to their customers.
That's one possibility. We could also see a comeback in domestic manufacturing in certain countries. Businesses are always looking for ways to shorten those supply chains and to reduce their exposure to global risks.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about all the potential ripple effects from this.
It really is. And while we can't predict the future with absolute certainty, I think it's safe to say that this USPS suspension is part of a much bigger shift, a shift towards a more diversified and resilient global economy.
And that's something we should all keep in mind as we navigate all of this uncertainty.
Absolutely. Adaptability, innovation, and a willingness to embrace change. Those are going to be key in the years to come.
Couldn't agree more. And before we sign off, I just want to remind our listeners that we love hearing from you. Have you been personally affected by this whole USPS suspension? What strategies have you found helpful in dealing with it?
Yeah, chime in down in the comments. We're all in this together, and we can learn so much from each other's experiences.
Exactly. Your stories and your perspectives really enrich this conversation. And they help us all make sense of this complex issue. So don't be shy, share your thoughts.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the USPS situation, it's important to remember that this isn't just about packages and shipping delays.
Yeah, it's much bigger than that.
It's a glimpse into those larger forces that are shaping the global economy. Geopolitical tensions, those vulnerable supply chains, and even that evolving relationship between consumers and producers.
It's all connected.
Exactly. And as we've discussed, those forces are creating both challenges and opportunities.
So for businesses, it's a chance to rethink those supply chains, explore new markets, and build more resilient operations.
And for consumers, it's an opportunity to be more mindful about their consumption habits, support those local businesses, and prioritize quality and sustainability over cheap and fast.
It's a time for adaptation, innovation, and a shift in perspective.
Well said. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue this conversation. Share your experiences, your insights, and your questions in the comments below.
Let's keep learning from each other, supporting each other, and navigating this complex landscape together.
Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. The more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to make those smart decisions for ourselves, our businesses, and our world.
That's what the deep dive is all about. We're here to help you connect the dots, see the bigger picture, and empower you to take action.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the topics that matter most. Until next time.